Hello, my friends. It's great to be here with you guys tonight. I guess afternoon, night, depends where you are in the country. Let me just make sure. I bumped my computer so my camera's a little bit off. Anyway, so that looks good. Yeah, okay, I'm sorry, I'm being autistic. Alright, so I hope everyone is doing well tonight. Let me see if there's any announcements to make. Briefly, I just wanted to say that when it comes to YouTube comments, I forgot to mention this yesterday. I do not delete YouTube comments. I think I've only deleted like one or two in my entire time on YouTube. In both circumstances, or in whatever the circumstance was, it was really vitriolic and unnecessarily divide. Like, it was something that was really uncalled for and uncharitable, and so I removed it. I didn't think it was appropriate for the comment section. But in general, I don't remove comments, and so if you correct me on something, I didn't remove it. It was the YouTube algorithm. They remove a lot of comments, and so I get people who will complain about, like, I might say, I think I said, like, the wrong Latin root. I think I said that the EX in, like, extreme unction is the same one as escape. And I think I meant to say exit. It's the same root, but I think I said escape instead. My brain sometimes, when just juggling things around, it makes mistakes like that. And so, yeah, I didn't delete that, like, comments like those. I appreciate them. I appreciate you guys keeping me accountable, keeping me, on track, making sure I'm doing the right thing. That's very kind, you guys. I'm not the one who deletes the comments. I just wanted to bring that up in case people thought I was trying to silence them or anything like that. Yeah, that YouTube AI sucks. It's good to see American Grayson. Great guy. Hope he's doing well. Hope everyone's having a great summer. Like I said in the last stream, I'm not going to be doing too many of these. I'll probably do maybe 2 more streams at max before I move. So there's not much that I can do in this short amount of time, so I'm just going to kind of pick topics that I think are either important to talk about or relevant, what have you. Let me drop the entropy link real briefly. Yeah, I saw that American Grayson was at the trans riot. I saw that on Telegram. I have to check his YouTube channel to see if he posts anything about it. If you guys moving to college? No, that's a great question, Morty. I'm moving because I got a job. I finished college, so I got a job, and now I'm moving to start that job in a different state all the way across the country, so I'm looking forward to it. Racist Incel! It's good to see you, man. I haven't seen you in forever. Even when you choose to allow all comments on YouTube, YouTube will remove comments it thinks are too hateful. It happens in my comment section all the time. When I see the notification, the comment is gone. Yeah, that's exactly what happened to me too. So if you guys are interested in asking me questions, and in case I might otherwise miss it, you can use the entropy link to do so. I reset the waifu tag, so if you donate, you can get the waifu permits in the Discord. I don't know how great that is, but anyway, it's something I do. I do special things for them here and there, so just something to say thank you, basically, to my Patreon supporters as well as people who donate. So what are we talking about tonight? A lot of things. We're going to talk about a lot of good things. I didn't take any notes, so it's going to be all off the cuff, so I apologize if some things are going to be a little bit unorganized or not as articulate as they ought to be. But in any case, we're going to be talking about good popes, bad popes. We're going to be talking about a bad king. We're going to be talking about the fall of Christendom and God's judgment upon it. That is kind of the overview of what we're talking about tonight. It is the crisis of the modern world, where it all began, the genesis of all the problems we see. Nihilism, materialism, with rationalism, we see all this ever increasing, ever accelerating descent, this involution towards madness, towards chaos, towards destruction, both in our country and in Europe and frankly the whole world. And so tonight, I'm going to do my best to diagnose for you guys where this all came from and why. And it was thanks to this book here. It brought a lot of good insight for me. I'm going to be kind of building off ideas that are present within it. This is Spiritual Authority and Temporal Power by Rene Guénon, as well as a chapter in this book, Our Glorious Popes. I don't even think they make this book anymore, but in case they do, I would check those out. If you're interested in kind of more information or more details about things we're talking about here. So yeah, someone says it's from the Jews, and the thing is, the why is obviously in the West there was a strong reaction against Semitic influence up until like the end of the Middle Ages, until like the Enlightenment. So why did that change? Why did everything change? And one of the reasons I heard from a non-Christian, someone who's a reactionary but not a believer in Jesus Christ, they said it was because the church is too universal in her objective to convert all nations, and because of this universal call to convert all the nations of the world, and her stance that we're all made in the image of God, because of the church's belief in that, then the European peoples were indoctrinated into thinking that we should just bring in endless refugees or something to that effect. Basically, that this was some proclivity that created the problems we see today. And I don't think that is at all the case, especially since in the Middle Ages, the church was going to war with the closest thing you have today to like diversity or to an outside culture, which is to say the Ottoman Empire, and to the Muslims. The church was very much resisting their influence in Christendom and into Europe. And they, in fact, waged a crusade against them. And even in like papal statements concerning condemnations, and these were much later on, by the way, not until World War II do we see these, that were condemning things like race idolatry. Even in those, the popes made it very clear that you could still be a nationalist, you could still care about your people, so long as it had its proper place in the hierarchy of goods. And that's a conversation for another time. But in any case, that has nothing to do with the fall of the West. The fall of the West started because of the revolt of the Kshatriyas. And so to begin, you have to kind of understand some theory. Unfortunately, before I can kind of get into the application of theory, before I can get into a deep delve into the history, which I imagine that's going to be the most interesting part. You guys want to hear about Boniface VIII and Clement V. Those are the two popes we're really going to focus on. But first, I have to do the boring part. I got to get out of the way. Hopefully it won't be boring for everyone, but I got to bring up some theory. And that brings us back now. Let's go back all the way to ancient Greece. Let's just rewind the clock all the way to ancient Greece. We have this guy named Parmenides. Parmenides, I think that's how you say the name. Parmenides? Anyway, it doesn't matter. He's a Greek philosopher. He denies that change is real. Okay, that's what he believes. Change is not real, it's an illusion. And to back this up, another Greek philosopher named Zeno comes up with a few paradoxes, the most famous of which is the one that says basically, and I think most people know about this one is usually just termed Zeno's paradox, but it says that, okay, imagine a distance of like this length here, and imagine if I moved, in order to move from here to here, I would have to move halfway. And if I kept dividing in half, I moved halfway, and then I would move halfway between here and here, that'd be a fourth, and then an eighth, and I'd have to moving halfway over and over and over again ad infinitum. And if I kept having to move in halves, then I would never reach my actual final destination. But I do reach my final destination. So how is that possible? And they said, well, it's just illusion. Change is an illusion. Your entire life is an illusion. It really made no sense. But that is really the kind of the consequence of any materialistic philosophy. And this is kind of applying now this concept, more broadly speaking, to materialism. When you don't have some overarching principle to explain change, then all you have is this paradox of endless change. You get absurdity. And that is what like materialism is founded on, is this idea that everything is material, while material reality is infinitely divisible, and therefore if a philosophy founded on this is going to find itself in certain paradoxes of this sort. In order to solve this paradox, in comes Aristotle. Aristotle, the One of the Thomas Aquinas sometimes refers to him as the philosopher. Very, astute, erudite individual. Very important in ecclesiology and in philosophy, scholastic philosophy, that is to say. And so Aristotle comes along, and he says, he creates this principle in which we can understand change. He says that there is the act of change, and then there's the potential to engage in change. So, for example, let me see it. If I have my matches, that's like the easiest example. All right, let me get them real quickly to explain this concept a little easier here. Right now, I have a match. Okay, it's just static. Okay, and so it has the potential to light on fire, but it has not been actualized yet. And so when I apply motion to it, let me know if you guys hear noises in the background. I have the window open to keep things kind of cooled off, but let me know if that's a distraction. Anyway, and so when I, do this, it becomes actual. The potential to create fire becomes actualized. I want to know fast. Okay. So that's kind of the framework in which she was able to describe change, is through this principle of act and potency. And he believed it was inherent within the substance of different and like depending on form and matter, but we don't really need to go into all those details. All you need to know is that there was this problem of endless change, and the way Aristotle solved it was by having an unchangeable principle. And it had to be an unchangeable principle in which we could explain and describe change, because if this principle was subject to change, then you would have to explain that which was changing the principle. And then you'd have this infinite regress. And this is kind of where Aristotle began to develop the idea of the unmoved mover. You have to have something that is motionless, and that is the principle, because without some principle that is unmoved, all you have is paradox. And we cannot have paradox. We have to have some no one lives in a paradoxical world. We all live with change, and therefore we'd have to have some unmoved principle to explain it. And the answer to Zeno's paradox, therefore, is that there's a potential for an infinite number of like segments. You can go half, a quarter, an eighth, a 16th, etc. There's the potential to do that, but that is not actualized. This infinite succession is not actualized. Rather, the succession to move from here to here is actualized. The potential to be this infinite like approaching is not actualized. And so that is how Aristotle was able to solve Zeno's paradox. At least that is one of the ways. I've heard other like mathematicians, I think, have offered other explanations, in which I'm not too interested in, because that is not really relevant to what we're talking about today. And so we see this importance of pure principle and change. And this is something that every civilization has always understood. In the East, the way that they've referred to it, in the Far East and the Oriental countries, they've referred to it as contemplation and action, or knowledge and action. And contemplation was always superior to action. Contemplation always preceded action and was always the foundation for action. In India, in the Hinduism, they refer to it as Shruti and Smrti. Shruti being what they call direct knowledge. This is to say, it is like the direct principle upon which reality is based. That is to say, the only thing that is absolute, of course, is God, and so to understand God is to understand this ultimate principle behind which all reality is oriented, and that is what metaphysics is. And so they were able to picture this as like the sun. The sun provides us direct light, like directly to us. And then they described smrti, or action, as the moon. The moon, which takes in, absorbs light, and then it reflects it. It's been the application of light. So you have direct light, which is like pure knowledge, and then you have like a discursive kind of knowledge, or what you could call like action, or you're applying the knowledge you know. And this is the entire basis of ethics, and this is why it was the people who are interested in Smrti were studying what the Indians call Dharma, which is basically just natural law theory. To make it really simple without having to go into any details about pagan cultures and other groups of people that you're probably not interested in, because we're talking about the West tonight. So, the application, which is like ethics, you think about ethics and you're applying these higher principles about moral realism and morality, and you're applying it to, you know, the material world. And so you're trying to now take the principles of act and potency, and now you're kind of applying them in this way. That is what action basically is. And that is what the moon represented. Now, this is not really a side point, this will come in very handily later on. But it's very interesting because in alchemy, the moon was always supposed to share some essential quality with silver, and the sun was supposed to share some essential quality with gold. And the way that the sun and the moon interacted, it was believed because the world is made according to order and to some harmony, to some cohesion, to some coherence. There's something that is like, because it's all of course made by God, and so there's some like rules that regulate the ways that the bodies in the sky move and act. And it was believed that this was in correspondence with things that were happening in the spiritual realm as well. That is what astrology basically is. It's looking at the movement of bodies and basically trying to understand what's happening in the ethereal sphere. And then there was believed that the alchemy was kind of that on the micro level, because they shared some essential quality. In other words, the movement of the sun somehow affected the way gold was. And you can take this for what it is, but this is what they believed back then. It affected the way gold was, and by studying these chemical interactions, this early form of chemistry, you could have insight into the spiritual realm as well. Again, because the order, the harmony of nature, the way that things kind of like, it's like an orchestra, the way the natural laws all work together. It's very orderly, and that it was not by an accident. We believe that God designed it for that reason, and that these order would apply just as much to the physical world as well to the spiritual realm. Everything what we see on Earth does not exhaust everything that is. That is like the most important thing that you can remember tonight. That everything that we see is just matter and material change. That does not exhaust everything that is. And we just mentioned that there has to be some principle like act and potency to explain change. There has to be something under the surface that is transcendental. And so so the sun represents direct knowledge, the moon represents applied knowledge or action, which is represented as gold and silver, and the Saint Peter, he has two keys. One key is gold. The other key is silver. One key represents the key to heaven and the kingdom of God that Christ gave him directly, and that was the key to the celestial kingdom. And the silver key is the the kingdom of the terrestrial realm. That is the key that was implicitly given to him, since the church is the intermediary between God and man. And that is kind of something we'll get to in a moment. But first, we have to kind of understand now the role of the caste. So we can kind of get an idea of the different kinds of knowledge. And so you start with just pure knowledge, and then you have the application of knowledge, and then as you move in more and more into the material occupations and material ways of thinking, the less and less it becomes necessary to apply this knowledge, and the more we can just think about things on an empirical level. And this is best understood by looking at the caste system, and which is going to be kind of I would say, the bedrock of my tonight's monologue, and also the direct reason why the West is where it is today. The upper, the top of the caste, the priest caste, or the church, the ecclesia docens, the teaching church, in Hinduism it's the Brahmins. These were the ones who were tasked with the responsibility to understand direct knowledge. They were the ones who were supposed to have the aptitudes to be able to interpret the various symbols used in religions that basically explain this direct knowledge. They were the ones to guard, safekeep, and preserve and conserve and transmit these principles to future generations in order so that the religion, and this was like the center of the religion, would remain stable. This was the job at St. Thomas Aquinas. Many people don't know this, but the Summa Theologica was not written for philosophers. The Summa Theologica was written for students who were learning philosophy. It may surprise many of you because many of you who read the Summa Theologica may have no idea what they're saying. And yet it was meant for young, like high schoolers and maybe early college kids to read in order to learn philosophy. It was supposed to be like a manual. How many people today really kind of understand that level of information? And by the way, when we're talking about young people, we mean like probably either priests or teachers, who are people who are kids who are interested in that profession. Not like, some guy who's working on the farm. Because again, there's a caste system, there's a system of various classes of people. And so people who had the aptitude for these things would have to learn about the direct knowledge, would have to be able to then conserve it and then transmit it to future generations. Because that is, the best, the way that Catholicism is best articulated and best understood is once we understand these philosophic principles. A lot of Catholic concepts like transubstantiation become much more illuminated once you kind of understand the difference between accidents and substance, things of that sort. And so it was the job of the Brahmins to preserve this metaphysical knowledge. And that was superior then to the Kshatriyas. The Kshatriyas were the warriors, they were the leaders. These were the ones who were tasked with governing and protecting. And I've already mentioned the sword and the scales to preserve internal order, as well as to propel any type of external force that might threaten the citizens of some domain. And that was their job. They were supposed to be virtuous. There were certain virtues attached to it. Their job was to make sure people lived holy lives, ethical lives, that they were able to propel the common good, maintain the common good, rather, I would probably be a better way to say it. And so what is associated with that group of people then was kind of the application of the metaphysical knowledge. You took all these metaphysical principles about natural law, and then you applied it to our natural situation. And so they would do things like ban incest, and they would promote traditional marriage. Things of this sort is the role of the state. Fortunately, today we don't really see that as much. And the next caste down would be the Vaishyas. The Vaishyas were the bourgeoisie or the third estate, and these ones were tasked with, they were the merchant class, or they were tasked with economic considerations, and they were much more removed now from these metaphysical principles. They dealt with money, and that was really their livelihood. So, they had to be honest, they had to be virtuous, and so the Kshatriyas kind of were supposed to keep them in line so that they didn't become greedy. Or they'd be filled with, so that everything wouldn't be consumed with the Vaishyas who were tasked again with like this merchant and commerce. Not everything would be then consumed with just commercialization, which is what we see today, which is very interesting, and I'll get to that. And then the next caste is the Shudras, which is, keep hearing cars. I'm gonna have to close this window. I'm sorry. Sorry, give me 1 minute. I apologize for the interruption. I'm worried you guys are gonna hear the cars. Sorry about that. I apologize again. Alright, so the Shudras, they're like the proletariat, and they're gonna be the least concerned with metaphysical knowledge, and they're the most concerned with just action, and the Vaishyas are supposed to kind of give them rules on how to regulate themselves. So you can kind of see this, or in the Kshatriyas as well, are supposed to regulate them. And so we see that of course, all of the metaphysical principles are contained in God, and in God established the church, or the Brahmins as the ones who had, or the church, the priest caste, whatever you want to call it, to preserve and protect this information and knowledge. And so contained within that, like you could say eminently, that's the way Rene Guénon says it, formally the priest caste is tasked with initiating their own, as well as the things I just mentioned, but they're also eminently contained in it the power to bestow temporal authority. And we see that in every single civilization, that the rites of initiation for the Kshatriyas, for the kings, for the shogun, whatever. Let's see, what other civilizations can you guys think of? Um, the emperor in China, whatever. I don't know the situation there as well, but whatever traditional civilization you can think of, it was always the spiritual center. Whoever the Brahmins were, they were the ones who kind of kinged them. Who literally in the West, they literally kinged them. Um, they were the ones who were tasked with initiating, bestowing upon them divine right. And so while maybe their birth kind of gave them the blessing from, or you could say it kind of gave them the foreshadowing that they were meant to be leaders just by nature of their birth, the fact that the king was the one who coronated them bestowed upon them legitimacy. That which is greater cannot come from that which is lesser. This is just a principle of numbers. This is a principle of hierarchy. That is why democracy is failed. That is why it is flawed, because the people who are meant to be governed cannot be the ones who are governors. The governors are distinct from those who are to be governable. God is the one who is the ultimate governor. He's the end in itself, and then he sets the church as the next rank of governors, and then the church establishes or coronates the kings. And now the kings are not supposed to, of course, or rather the church isn't there to tell the kings how to do their job. That's not what they're there to do. The church is there to correct them if they were to err in spiritual things, or if they were to do things that are evil. They can, and this is things that happened in the Middle Ages, they could put countries on interdict. If a country was doing something evil, I think saying King John, was it King John of England, was like a really evil king. I think the Pope put the whole country on interdict, shut it down basically, stopped having sacraments until things could be settled. They would excommunicate kings that were not being submissive to Rome, which was a big deal back then, because that basically removed then their divine right. That meant a lot to the kings. They needed like the blessing of God, the blessing that it was this sign of legitimacy being bestowed upon them. That is why all the leaders in democratic countries, it's very difficult to basically make sense of where their legitimacy comes from. It seems like all legitimacy has to come from God, but if the church, who is the representative of God between the material realm and the celestial realm, are kind of in the middle there, they're not the ones who are kind of bestowing that authority, then it's difficult to confirm that they really do have legitimate leadership on earth. It's not me telling people to disobey the federal government. I think that would be very imprudent. I'm just speaking as a philosopher. Alright, so going back to what I was saying, they also had the ability to give the rules of battle, the rules of engagement were decided by the church, and this is what made war and battle noble back then. This is why there was a noble warrior caste. Nowadays, anyone can be a soldier. Nowadays, we have compulsory education. These are all signs that quantity is more important than quality. That's one of the signs of the decay of our era. So they're able to give like rules of engagement to make battle honorable and noble. They were able to settle certain and to arbitrate disputes between countries, treaties, etc. Help to settle things if there's wars between countries. And so ultimately, all of Christendom, all of Europe, was united around this figure of the Pope and the teaching church and his bishops. That was the center of all of Europe. They were all united around that common pillar. And that common pillar sustained Europe up until the 1300s, when the Kshatriyas decided to revolt against the Brahmins. Now, I'm not too privy on the history of Hindu culture and society in India, so I don't know exactly when they had the Kshatriyas revolt against the Brahmins, but in the West, the same kind of idea happened in the 1300s, and that's where we kind of leave off. That's kind of where we now can begin our historical analysis. So hopefully, did that make sense? Does anyone have any questions before I go into now the historical analysis? So that was kind of the theory behind what I'm talking about tonight. Castes and the difference between, you have this direct knowledge, and then you have varying degrees of knowledge as the caste system go. As the castes get lower and lower, you have less and less metaphysical knowledge that you're dealing with or the application of it. And you just have more and more just pure material principle. So let me know if anyone has any questions real quick. Okay, doesn't look like it. I just want to make sure that, we don't get in, we can get that out of the way. Alright, so again, yeah, it is the power to bestow kings, or the power to bestow, the temporal authority, is eminently contained in the Brahmins or into the priest caste or the Pope, and it's formally contained in the Kshatriyas or the kings or the lords or whatever, the second estate. Alright, now that out of the way, let's talk about a great and holy Pope, Boniface VIII. Pope Boniface VIII, it was said that when he was celebrating Mass, he would cry, he would shed tears, not because he's like feminine, but just because he understood just how great the sacrifice is. He was someone who prayed 2 hours daily. So he was a very good pope. And then it was around this time that then you have a not so good person. That is kind of, it seems to be the kind of the history of the world. You have someone who's good, like in conflict with someone who's bad. You have a good pope, and then you have this 13-year-old who ascends to the throne in France. Philip the Fair, as he's called, that's his surname, or Philip the Fourth, and he's only 13 at the time. Very immature kid, so I won't give him too hard of a time. And so the Vaishyas, or the Third Estate, or his lawyers, they basically are able to kind of like wiggle their way in there, you could say. They're kind of like, they're snakes whispering in his ear. Have you ever seen Lord of the Rings and the Two Towers? There's Grim a Wormtongue, and he's always whispering in the ear of King Theoden until the curse is removed by Gandalf. It's a great scene, you should definitely check it out. That's kind of what was happening. It was this, young, inexperienced king who was being manipulated by the lower caste, basically was manipulating him. And the lower caste, of course, is known, without being regulated by the Kshatriyas. The Kshatriyas are supposed to be virtuous. They're supposed to enforce virtue. Then the vice that is very well known to the bourgeoisie is greed. And that is what we see happen. They were able to kind of corrupt Philip. He was known for his gambling addiction. And then he also started a war with England. And because he started a war with England, it costs a lot of money. And because he's a gambler, he also, takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of money to, fund something like that. So he's not a good guy. Not very prudent with his purse. And so he borrows a lot of money from the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar is one of the last, like you could say, openly esoteric groups in Christendom. That is to say that they're a group of monks who are, again, they're the ones who are receiving this direct metaphysical knowledge and disseminating it indirectly throughout Christendom in order to retain that spiritual principle on which the entire structure is supported. And so he borrows all this money from the Knights Templar, and he can't pay it back. And so he ends up basically creating all these rumors about the Knights Templar, basically forces them into torture. Under pain of torture, people will say a lot of things. Some people said, oh, the Knights Templar, they committed sodomy, they kissed each other, they worshipped Muhammad, I think is like Baphomet, but that meant Muhammad back then. Anyway, they made a bunch of stuff up. A lot of them got killed. And then later on, Pope Clement V would absolve their order in 1312. And so we see the last kind of group that is trying to receive metaphysical knowledge disappear. And so that is one of the aspects of why the West collapsed, I think. But that is kind of less obvious that would do it. I think that's less obvious to most people. Like, why would that cause the West to fail? But if it makes sense to me that if material, without some principle to govern how things change, then you have absurdity. And that's why Aristotle came along with act and potency. So without something like the Knights Templar, which is trying to preserve these metaphysical principles, without that, then society eventually degenerates. But there's another reason as well, and this one's more obvious. And that now goes back to Boniface VIII. He sees what's going on. He doesn't like it. He tells the king that he should stop his war. The king instead takes church land, starts to confiscate church property, appropriate church salaries. He taxes the church. He raises a tax on the church, which had been unheard of. The church was considered its own governing body, superior to any temporal structure, and therefore to be taxed would be to basically say that they are somehow subordinate to Philip, and that would be absurd, that'd be ludicrous for anyone living in the Middle Ages. And so Boniface VIII, he writes this encyclical, rather a papal bull, that basically says you can't put taxes on the church. I think he writes a few others, and one of them was called, like, in Latin, "Listen, sonny." Basically, it's like, I think it's like listen, son. It's basically Boniface VIII. He's an older guy, and so he's trying to teach this young king how to run, like how to actually do it. And he's basically like, look, when you err, I'm the one who's supposed to keep you accountable, and you've erred pretty badly here, and so I'm the one who's supposed to keep you in check. But Philip the Fourth had no intention of listening whatsoever. He had no respect for the Pope, because he was being again corrupted by the Vices, or the Third Estate. They were whispering in his ear, these lawyers were, and I'm sure that's not the old, like, I don't want to blame them entirely. I'm sure Philip IV was just not very responsible or mature individual, frankly. And so we see here this revolt against the Pope, and that is where the entire West collapsed because of that. Then after Philip IV sees this papal bull by Boniface VIII, he basically commits calumny against Boniface VIII, disseminates bits of information. Yeah, it literally is like, "Listen, son." That was literally like the name. You can look it up. He commits calumny against Boniface VIII, spreads really malicious rumors about him. To this day, some of them remain, which is why Dante described Boniface VIII burning in hell. I think it was in the 8th circle of hell. Boniface VIII was burning in Inferno, and because of, like, a lot of these rumors that were disseminated by the evil Philip the Fair. Of course, Boniface VIII is very distraught by this, and so he calls a council of Catholic bishops from France. The king says any bishop who goes, they're forbidden from going. Their lands will be confiscated if they go. Doesn't matter, because people know the Pope is superior. So the bishops go. They go to this conference, and that's where Unam Sanctam is written. Unam Sanctam is probably one of the most powerful papal bulls you could ever read. It's short. You can read it in like 20 minutes. No, probably less, like 5 minutes you can read it. I'd read the whole thing out, but that's unnecessary. It basically begins by saying, "Extra ecclesiam nolla salus." Outside the Catholic Church, there is no salvation. The Church is the saving body of Christ. The Christ is the invisible head of the Church, and the Pope is its visible head. And then it says that the Pope has 2 swords. That is the word he uses, 2 swords, and this comes from a verse in Luke. And the verse in Luke, Jesus asks his disciples, "How many swords do you guys have?" And they said 2, and he says, "That's enough." Now, some people think that means that Christians are aggressive or violent because they had swords or something like that. I've heard like in weird interpretations about that verse. That verse does not mean anything about actual combat. What that verse means, and this is something I think Saint Bernard pointed out, and this is what's being repeated here by Pope Urban VIII, is that the Church has 2 swords. One governs the spiritual order, and one the temporal order. The spiritual, of course, is superior to the temporal. The temporal must be subordinate to the spiritual. Basically everything I just said earlier. And that if the spiritual is to err, if the temporal is to err or to commit injustices, and basically not to do its job. If the caste that is designed to keep order and maintain virtue is not doing its job, it's not applying these principles correctly, then the superior caste, the Brahmins, the Church, must intervene and must make an intervention, and that's exactly what Urban VIII is doing here, and that is why Philip the Fair needs to listen to what the Pope is saying about these taxes. And then he ends with this infallible declaration. He speaks ex cathedra, that is to say, from this seat. And this is not the Pope speaking. This is the Pope, is rather Jesus Christ speaking through the Pope. and then this thunderous kind of, I just imagine when he's writing this, is this thunderous voice. He says it in like, as if he's like imbued with this flame of fury and passion. I don't know, it's just like my imagination. But anyways, this is a thunderous statement. It says here, furthermore, we declare, we proclaim, we define. Whenever the church defines something, it has to be infallible. That is absolutely necessary for our salvation, that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. Amen. And I imagine him just stamping the document with the fisherman's ring. He dips it in the wax and stamps it. Such an epic, epic in the true sense. A lot of people use that word kind of loosely, but epic in the true sense of just this thunderous, climactic experience. And just to end the papal document, it is absolutely necessary salvation of every creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff. And this happened in 1302. Now, when imagine now, let's do some brainstorming here. What do you think was Philip VI's reaction when he heard this? Well, for one, he took away all the bishops' land that had been all the bishops that had gone to this this conference, this council. They had their land taken, confiscated. I'm curious, does anyone have any ideas of what Philip V might do? If you don't know, this is audience participation moment. Get your audience participation points here. Make sure you're listening. I want to see an answer from everyone. What are some of your ideas? If you know the answer, don't say it. But what do you think he might do? He hears the Pope say that it is absolutely necessary to be subject. By subject, he means to be subordinate to the Pope. Yeah, you're supposed to guess, Winston, not just say, let me guess. Did he kill himself? That's a terrible guess. Alright. Alright, no guesses? Okay. Declare war on Rome, better. Okay. Any others? I'll wait for a tiny bit longer. Sorry to the people on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube. But it's probably the way in which I can retain audience participation. Alright. Okay. Basically, only Winston guessed. Auctions the land off for more gambling money, says Cheesehead. 69. That is... I don't know if he used the money for gambling. It's probably more for the war. But yes, he used the money for sure that he confiscated. That is definitely true. Murder the priest, become Protestant. Protestantism was not yet defined or in existence. That was later. This is still the Middle Ages. That was the Renaissance. That was like, I guess you could say the High Middle Ages. This is like Middle Ages. These are good guesses. Good guesses. What does he do? They declare war on Rome is the closest. He sends his troops, he sends some knights, they barge into Rome, they barge into the church where the Pope was initially praying, and the Pope, when he hears them coming, he leaves the church. He was initially praying, he leaves the church, and he goes into the papal mansion. The knights, they can't break into the door of the papal mansion. It's too strong. And so they instead do is they light the church on fire. Now what they realize is that there's actually an entrance from the church into the papal mansion, and that's when they find that, the Pope realizes he's screwed. And so he's watching out the window, the church burn, and he realizes his time is coming to an end. And to prepare, he says, and I think this is almost a direct quote, I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but he says something like, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die. If I'm going to die for Jesus Christ, then I'm going to die the sovereign pontiff. And so he takes upon his head the papal tiara, he wears the papal cope, he puts in his hand, and he kisses it, and then it says he holds it close to his chest, the papal cross, and then he sits on the papal throne. And so he's there in all his vestments and all his glory, shrouded with the air of holiness, according to the bishop who stood, or rather there was 2 cardinals who stood next to him, 2 very holy cardinals. All the rest of the cardinals had escaped. They had left Rome out of fear for their lives. The one of them who remained would later become Benedict, one of the Benedicts, I forget which one. He would later become Pope and clear Boniface's name, basically. And so they stood by his side, and that's where we get these reports from. According to the cardinals, his face shone like the sun, and even though he was like 80 years old, he looked as though he was a young and vibrant man, because he just was so blithely ready to die. He was so ready and jubilant about just being able to die a martyr. Ready to die like St. Peter and Clement and all the initial popes. I think the first like 10 popes all were martyred. And so then they break down the doors. The French guy whose name I cannot pronounce for the life of me, so I won't even try, this captain of the guard, he walks over to the Pope, tells him that he's taking him hostage. The Pope says, "Here is my head, here is my neck. I am the sovereign pontiff, and if you will not submit to something like that, if you will not submit, then here it is. Here I am. Basically, I'm ready to die." Something to that effect. And then he, instead of killing him, because he's kind of blown away by this, he's still French. So, France is the eldest daughter of Catholicism. All the barbarians by this point had been converted to Catholicism. This was the church's at its peak. Probably during the time of Innocent III, that's when you could say like the church was in its height. And so at this point, France was considered the most established of all these Catholic nations. So maybe just intuitively, based on his just being French, I don't know. But in any case, instead he takes out his gloves and slaps him with it, which is considered very offensive, by the way, for a knight to slap the Holy Roman Pontiff. And then they take him away. They lock him up, I think, for 3 days. Like, he's beaten badly. And then he's like put in like under house arrest. And then he dies of fever. He was basically martyred. The book that I talked about describes it as him being martyred. And then once he dies, that is basically when God enacts his judgment upon Christendom. The fact that the eldest daughter would turn her back upon the church, upon God's church, was not something that God could overlook. And for that reason, we see then the ultimate collapse of the church's power and in Europe, and then we see the rise of nation states. And I'll get to that, but first we have to continue with Boniface VIII. I'm getting ahead of myself. So Boniface VIII, he dies. They make a bunch of rumors about him, and then Philip the Fair pressures, or basically is able to put his guy on the papal seat, the papal throne, Clement V, and he moves the papacy away from Rome to Avignon. They call this time the Avignon Crisis. It's like the Babylonian captivity for the church, basically. And if you assume there will be like many people claiming to be pope, it'll be one of the worst crises the church has ever experienced, that Europe has ever experienced, and probably worse than we're experiencing now. I know things are bad now with Pope Francis, but things were really bad back then. Like, people thought the world was going to end. That's how bad things were. So the Clement V, he dissolves the Knights Templar, and then he also puts Boniface VIII posthumously on trial. Obviously, he's dead, so he can't stand trial, but he puts him on trial. A bunch of people make up a bunch of stuff about how he committed sodomy, and they do a bunch of lying. They're very good at lying, these Frenchmen. Anyway, as an Anglo, it was an Anglo joke. Anyway, so they did a lot of lying against this guy. A lot of calumny was said, and the Pope is tired of this. He doesn't want to. Clement V is not like a terrible Pope. The problem was that the Kshatriyas revolted against the Brahmins. They took over. He was under the king's thumb, and so he kind of just washes his hands of the whole situation and says, let him be tried by the French bishops. They can handle this. I'm going to pardon the guy as a kind of a nice gesture. I'll pardon the officer of the guard who slapped the Pope. I will say the king, as long as he was acting under good intentions, he was doing all right. Basically, that's what he said. Even if he committed calumny, he probably had good intentions. That's what he said. He's like, oh, if he had good intentions, then he's doing okay. He didn't commit any sins. Basically, just to save himself, wash himself for the whole situation. and just to remove from it. And so now the French bishops, they have their own trial, and at the trial, 3 cardinals come forth. I think the 2 of them being the ones that like saw him die, Boniface VIII die, and this is just such a great story. I love telling this. One of the cardinals basically testified that he was one of the holiest popes they had ever seen, that he was a very educated and astute man, and then they also bring forth 2 knights who basically vouch for the orthodoxy of Boniface VIII, and they say, we want a trial by combat. And if they basically challenged these knights, these like 2 knights challenged and said, we will prove his innocence unto death. They did a trial by combat and said, if anyone can basically fight us and kill us, then Pope Boniface VIII is guilty. Otherwise he's innocent. That was basically the arrangement, which I think is hilarious, and that just really speaks to the virtue of these knights, the honor of these knights, that they would stand up for like this dead pope who had been slandered by everyone. He had been abandoned by the people of Rome, by the people of France. A lot of them had very negative views of this pope. And and so these knights, they stood up and said, we want trial by combat. We believe he is innocent. We believe he was a good pope. If anyone thinks otherwise, they can fight us to the death. Of course, these bishops and cardinals, they don't want to die or get into any fights, so they say, no one wants to challenge you. We'll close the matter. And so Boniface VIII was cleared of all charges, and to this day he is regarded in as a good pope, partly because of that. Obviously, people would probably later go on and see what happened and be able to see what the truth, and the fact that the whole situation was very contrived by the bourgeoisie, these greedy, sinister lawyers. Later on, Benedict, whatever is the cardinal that was with him when he died, he'd become Pope Benedict the something another, and he would clear Boniface VIII of all charges. He would say he was a good pope, and then he went missing. I think he like disappeared, I think is the way the book said it. So he got kind of mafia style, mafia kind of got to him, basically, because he like stood up for what's right. That's the way at least the book kind of presents it. In any case, this was the beginning of the end. Now that the king had united himself with the Vaishyas, he was able to take power away from the other lords. You have to keep in mind that in the feudal era, it wasn't like an absolute monarch. The king had to work with these kind of regional governments. It's very kind of similar to, I say, to the federal government, and then you had like states. Well, you had like a king of France, and then you had various regions around France, and they would have their own lords and barons and dukes, and I don't know how all the whole system worked, but the aristocracy. And so it was very complicated. And of course, a lot of these people would resist Philip the Fair and his power grab, his trying to acquisition of wealth. And so to kind of suppress them, he unites himself with the bourgeoisie to take them on. He basically becomes one of the first, or France becomes one of the first absolute monarchies. Later on, we'll see other countries become like that. And we see the principle now that France was built on was no longer Catholicism. It was no longer seen as this nation that was united with all Christendom, and that its central principle was the Catholic Church. Rather, now its central principle was this king, this temporal leader. And so we see now the suppression of the metaphysical principles. And once you start suppressing these metaphysical principles, once you try to overthrow and undermine the principle, this eternal principle that has to basically be the foundation, this unmoved mover upon which you can kind of build the statue or the structure of society. Imagine like this water bottle here, you have the foundation. This is kind of like what the church is supposed to be, to provide the foundation. And as you go up the foundation, you get farther and farther from it. And so basically remove the foundation. And so the whole thing begins to sink. The entire civilization begins to sink. And at first it's very slow, because the knights and the kings, they're still to some extent virtuous people. They still cared about, they're still statesmen. So this time was, very long lasting. And then, of course, the much more greedy, much more avarice, much filled with cupidity the third estate and the bourgeoisie overthrew the monarchs in the French Revolution, and we see this also in the American Revolution and other revolutions in Europe. And then we see kind of the rise of neoliberalism. And when the Kshatriyas, they were in control, the way that they were able to reinterpret, now that the church no longer had a monopoly on metaphysical knowledge, because they're the only ones who can truly understand metaphysical knowledge, now we saw rationalism appear. We saw Descartes, we saw Kant, we saw Leibniz, we saw Spinoza, we saw these Hume and Locke, we saw all these Enlightenment thinkers rise up, and the way that they interpreted tradition was very different. We saw them come at things from a very individualistic perspective instead of seeing things from a very hierarchical point of view, with God at the center of everything. But they weren't, a lot of them weren't terrible. Leibniz was a substance pluralist. They all believed, most of them believed in God, though they were drifting far from the church. And then once the Vaishyas took over, then the principles in which the Vaishyas operate, things like commercialism and merchandise, became everything. Everything became commoditized. That is what liberalism is, really. That is what the society we're living in is. It's taking these principles of economy and now applying it to everything. Now, when we talk about immigration, we're talking about supply and demand. Now, we're talking about a people here, a nation. I don't care about these economic principles if there's something higher and more important at stake. And yet that seems to be, one of the things that most people who are economic, or rather immigration hawks or doves, they always want to bring up is these immigration perspectives. And I can understand if you're trying to just convince people who already have this presupposition that maybe that's what you're going to go for. But just the fact that people have this presupposition in the first place, that the way we should come at these things through this economic angle, is very concerning. Another one is like wages. Like thinking about the fact that there's a just wage. We're not, I know that the libertarians want to tell you that we should just apply the laws of supply and demand that we apply to commercial goods, and which is how we determine prices. We should just apply them to people and to workers, and that's how we should determine wages. But that's not how the church teaches us at all. We have human dignity, we have value, and we need a system that reflects that. And a system that is run by the merchants, that's run by the bourgeoisie, is not going to have that. Instead, they're going to have, like I said, commercialism, consumerism. That is going to be the directing principle on which the society is now built. It's no longer the king and the king's virtues. It is no longer the church and God's higher order. It is now commercialization and the materialism. That is now the thing that is kind of the governing principle on which unfortunately our state and our civilization is now dependent on. And this period is going to be shorter last than the last. And the next period, of course, then the prediction of René Guénon is that the Shudras rise up, basically the proletariat overthrow the bourgeoisie. We already just saw hints of this with communist revolutions in China and other places, and in Russia. We'll see if something like that happens again in the West. But in any case, René Guénon says that each of these revolts, the revolt of the lower caste against the higher caste, and then the way that they're going to interpret basically whatever principle it is that they're going to build society on, is going to be based on their caste. And the further they are removed from the ability to have the aptitude to receive metaphysical knowledge, as say the Brahmins, further removed from that caste, the more society is going to be built around materialistic principles and less upon pure knowledge and pure metaphysics. And that's exactly what I say. René Guénon really got the nail on the head there. And the way it describes it is like, let's see, I needed like an incline. All right, just imagine an incline. Imagine like a ball rolling on the incline. And then imagine if the incline got steeper and steeper and steeper and steeper, kind of out of frame. But as the incline gets steeper, the ball is going to accelerate. It's going to get faster, I think, if I understand physics. I think if I use my two eyes, that's the way it looks. So, as it gets steeper, that's true, because gravity is having a more and more direct pull on it. And so as we get farther and farther away from these metaphysical principles, these cycles are going to speed up faster and faster. The amount of time they last is going to be shorter and shorter, because anything that is material is self-destructive. That is what kind of defines matter, is the fact that it can be divisible. And so anything that is built on a materialistic foundation is eventually destined to collapse in on itself. It's just inherent in its very principle. And that's what we spoke about at the beginning, like Zeno's paradox. Like, if you have no principle on which to explain change, then you have absurdity, you have paradox. You have to have some unchangeable principle. And so once you remove that unchangeable principle, and now that we're applying less and less of the principle, the Vaishyas are applying it to some extent, or rather the Kshatriyas are the ones who are applying it the most directly, and then the Vaishyas and the Shudras, etc., etc. Once they've kind of been dissipated, then the degeneracy accelerates. The degeneracy accelerates, and the collapse is inevitable. That is what René Guénon says. Whether or not that will happen remains to be seen. I'll let you, as the viewer, decide that part. There's a lot of people would probably disagree, but in any case, what is the main takeaway? What is the solution now? So we see kind of where it all began. All the problems began. We saw after that then the Renaissance, and like I said, then the Enlightenment and the Protestant Revolution or Revolt. A Protestant revolt is probably the best example of like materialism at work, because Protestantism is founded on individualism, that the individual can interpret the Bible for himself, that the individual is as the authority basically to go directly to God, or the individual rather has the ability to understand God, understand metaphysics for himself without some special cast to help him understand. It's a very arrogant position. That he can somehow understand 2,000 years of church tradition better than all the popes and theologians and philosophers, and even better than all the church fathers who were in direct contact with the apostles. And Protestants think they have a better view, they have a better glimpse into what God actually wants. In any case, we see how many Protestant denominations? 33,000, something like that. We see all these Protestant sects. It's Martin Luther, then Calvinism, then Zwingli, and then we see Baptist and Methodist and Presbyterians and Pentecostals and Methodists. I think I said that one. Anglicans, and so we see this endless splitting, and that is exactly a symptom of materialism. The fact that there is this endless division. That is something that's just inherent in matter, and inherent in anything that's for principle is materialism. So hopefully that was very illuminating. So just to end this, to wrap this up, what can we do moving forward now? And René Guénon, originally he thought that the solution would come through the Catholic Church, even though the Catholic Church no longer had the same power she once did, or the same hold and claim on tradition. All the structure was still there. It was all latent within the Catholic Church, and therefore, if there was a spiritual revival, it could come through the Catholic Church in Christendom, be revived. All the caste was still there, or rather, the structure was there, so therefore the caste could be there. But later on in this book, and that René Guénon writes, he thinks it's kind of too late for that, and so instead he thinks that they're just going to have to wait until what he calls the New Jerusalem, basically, which is for Christians the end times. I think René Guénon might have seen it a little differently. He kind of sees the Hindu cycles. That's the way he kind of looks at things. The way that as Christians can look at things is just that we're just going to have to wait it out until the end, until Jesus comes back, basically, and establishes heaven. Whether or not that's true, again, this is what René Guénon's saying, not me, but whether or not that's true, that's a different question. And so instead he says, in order to better but what we should do in the meantime is we need to have some intellectual elite, where we have to have some group of people that will maintain the tradition. And so once everything collapses, then they will be there among the ruins in order to rebuild. And that's kind of like the springboard on which Evola produced the idea of riding the tiger. Basically, you are to be a man of tradition. You have to be a man who understands his metaphysics. You to go against the tide, but you have to kind of go along with the tiger. You have to preserve these traditions that we have. We have to preserve the truths that on which Christendom was founded. We have to do everything we can to kind of ameliorate our situation, make it more livable. But ultimately, we just kind of have to ride this tiger out until it gets tired. And once the tiger gets tired, then we can stab it in the heart and kill it, and then take over. That's what we got to do. We got to ride the tiger. So, that's not very, not as hopeful as some people might like, not as white pill to some people like. But in the end, we'll win. That's the thing. That's the thing about all of darkness and materialism. It's just going to degenerate into a point it's unsustainable, and ultimately bring about its own collapse. And we can have confidence in that, and we can have confidence that God will not abandon his church. That's the other thing that is mentioned in the book, is the fact that Jesus Christ said to St. Peter, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. The church will last until the end of time. The church is the ark of salvation, out of sight of which there can be no salvation. As long as we cling to the church and preserve this metaphysical knowledge, that is to say, just the traditions, the principles on which our traditions are built, to the best of our ability, that is how we can achieve eternal salvation, and how we can build a better future for further our children and for their children and for all of our posterity going on. So thank you guys for listening tonight. That'll conclude the main portion of my show. I went kind of over, but if you guys have questions, I'm now interested in hearing what kind of questions you might have related to our subject tonight about the crisis of the modern world. Again, if you're interested in a deeper exposition, I recommend Rene Guénon. He does a good job with metaphysics, even if the way he comes at things is from a different perspective than necessarily a strict Christian one, which is the one I'm coming at. I think it's still still valuable information contained in it. And the way he ends Crisis of the Modern World, Rene Guénon says that there must be some elite, there must be some elect. He calls them the elect that are going to maintain this tradition. And then he says, Vincit omnia veritas. Truth conquers all things. That's how he ends the book. And he's like, never forget, or something like that. Vincit omnia veritas. Truth conquers all things. So long as we hold fast to the light of God, the light of truth, then the darkness and the tempest that consumes us and is around us cannot touch us. They can destroy our material bodies, but they can never touch our soul. All right, thank you guys. Let's see. Thank you so much for the super chat, Latino Groiper from yesterday. He says, AR, happy 4th, and God bless. Through the 4th was yesterday for me. So thank you for the super chat yesterday. Winston Fujimori says, I'm really sorry about my behavior the last time I was in VC with everyone. What I said was uncalled for and counterproductive. I was just, the videos being watched bothered me, and I have extreme reaction to the people that do things like that. You're forgiven. I already forgot what happened, so we were watching, I don't know if I want to say, it's kind of a private thing. Anyway, we were just watching like some ISIS videos, and he had a strong reaction. You're much forgiven. I have done similar things, so don't worry. It's alright. It's alright, big guy. It's understandable that you would have strong reactions. It was pretty visceral. Some of the stuff I myself was pretty disgusted by it too. So, it was very understandable. Thoughts on Testerum Benevolate Nostre? That's, if I understand correctly, that's the one on religious liberty, or against religious liberty. I have heard of this one. Let me open it up just to make sure I'm not saying anything that would be dumb. It's the one I think that talks about religious tolerance rather than religious liberty. Anyway, I'll open that one. I'll get back to that one. I'm going to read the rest of these super chats here. And then Nasuno, thank you for the super chat. You are cleared to be waifu, Fujimori, you too, and Latino Groiper as well. In the Discord, that is. That doesn't excuse what I said, though, and I want to extend... Alright, dude, you don't have to keep apologizing. You're good, man. I appreciate the money, though. He sends 2 super chats just to apologize. I appreciate it, man. You're forgiven. All was good. You're good, man. We all forgive you. I'm sure Oswald forgives you as well. I don't think Oswald was even offended. I wasn't really offended either. So you're good, man. Latina Groiper says, I watched this video that said all Protestant churches essentially became Catholic during the holidays. What does this mean? Is there any truth to this? During the holidays? Like Christmas? On Easter? I don't know what that means, to be honest. But if they're saying because all they baptize during these holidays, like I know Anglicans baptize on Easter Vigil just like the Catholics do, and because all baptisms are Catholic and therefore being baptized into the Catholic Church, then they're somehow Catholic. I'm not exactly sure. You'd have to show me the video. But the way in which, but just simply Protestants recognizing that Christmas is December 31st, even if they stole that from, the date, they stole their dates from the church. That is to say, they built their own ecclesiastical calendar or liturgical calendar, rather, on the churches, the Catholic Church's liturgical calendar. That doesn't mean that they become Catholic. They just stole it from us. The way they view it is actually different, and Marcel Lefebvre brings this up, and it was something I was going to bring up the last theology hour, but the way in which we view the liturgical calendar between Protestants and Catholics is different. There's a different way we view it. For Catholics, we view it as something that comes with graces. The liturgical calendar isn't something that we just like thinking about history. For Protestants, that's all it is. It's like they're just reflecting on these events. And for Catholics, that's not wrong. We do reflect on these events, or reflecting on them particularly in order to receive the graces from the sacrament that are connected to that event. For example, when we celebrate Pentecost, we think about our own confirmation, and therefore we're able to kind of excite the confirmation graces and that we received from that, and that the parts of the Mass that relate to certain, like for example, if we're celebrating the Incarnation at Christmas, then when we receive the body and blood of Jesus, body, blood, soul, and divinity, by receiving under the veil of bread and wine, or rather just bread, the communion, the Eucharist, receive Christ's body. We are able to receive basically the graces that are connected to the Incarnation, because Christ became man. Now man can participate in the divine by the transmutation of his soul. There's a lot I said there, and I'll get into more detail the next theology hour. And it's a great point to bring up. It's against American liberalism, yeah. The Testem Benevolente Nostrae, Benevolentiae, Testem Benevolentiae Nostrae. I think that's how you say it. Well, I'm sure my Latin scholars will be very upset regardless. It's about, so it condemns individual liberty, particularism, and it's based. What else is there to say? It's based and red-pilled. It condemns the Americanism. Americanism is a heresy. Look it up. Americanism is this heresy of separation of church and state. It is also contained in Pope, I think it's Pius the Ninth's Syllabus of Errors, the separation of church and state. And that's kind of what we talked about tonight. And I've touched on this more specifically in other places. But kind of an overarching theme, of course, then is, yes, the legitimacy of the king comes from the Pope. It's eminently contained in the Pope. Therefore, there is no separation of church and state. All there is the state submitting and is subordinate to the Pope. That isn't to say that, again, the church can then tell the state what taxes to raise. But if the state does not do its job correctly, it is to be judged by the Pope. Okay, any questions you guys have for me? I saw someone saying anime isn't based. Just cringe. And I don't know why you're here. Because this is a red pill. This is a based red pilled zone. Okay? No, we don't need cringe. Can you leave the cringe on the door? Go be a poo-poo face somewhere else, says Latino Roy. Poo-poo pee-pee. Yeah, go be pee-pee poo-poo somewhere else. This modern America, the great Satan. The culture, the current liberal culture, in a sense, certainly is, the whore of Babylon. I'll say liberalism is, yes. Liberalism has overtaken and overshadowed America. Go back to my 4th of July speech to hear when I say that America is not defined by these liberal ideas. These are transitory. These are not innate to our nature. These are things that came with kind of the fall of man, and therefore we're able to purge them from us. One of the things that are unique to our nature is the way in which we have adapted ourselves to the eternal law of God. That is to say, these perennial meaning like year by year, these perennial values, and the way in which we've interpreted them is particularly kind of this Anglo-Saxon Protestant way. And there are some good things that we've kind of emphasized in a unique fashion that we don't see in other cultures. This is something we want to preserve and retain and try to bring to the forefront of our society. This is the thing that we want to define our society by, and this is what makes us special and unique, and why we want to maintain our native demographics and conserve, our Christian heritage. It all goes with that. And it's very sad seeing just how, diverse America is in terms of its demographics now. It's like a lot of people in AF are not native stock, or they have no native stock in them. They are like Mexican, or I'm not saying I don't want them in the movement. It's just unfortunate that there aren't more, I guess, white people left. More, Native Americans who are native to America, not Indians. I'm not talking about those fellows. I'm talking about like the people who are native to America, the founding stock kind, the people who have that background. It's unfortunate not more of those are in the movement. That being said, no, I'm not against people who are of different descent being supporting America first. Not trying to kick you out. I'm just saying it's sad when I see so many of those ones and not enough for people more like myself and my background, or background of someone like Oswald or those guys. Too many Latino groypers. Let's just say there's I just see a lot of Latino groypers. Not enough just people who can say that had relatives on the Mayflower or something like that, or relatives who fought in the American Revolution. They have some roots here. That's kind of important. I think it's important to care about America, and I think it's important to be able to assimilate to American ways of doing things. Would be able to adopt this, and it's going to be difficult for people who are not, do not share our same nature, and therefore the spirit of our people. That being said, though, it's not impossible. I believe it can assimilate. But the best thing they could probably do is be absorbed into the American hegemonic culture through, if they're Italian, by marrying into Anglo families and what have you, that they can be you can internalize this externality. Winston Fujimori, thank you very much for the super chats. Winston Fujimori and Latino Groiper, really thank you very much, man. You guys have both been big money wages this week, so I really appreciate it. He says, all the nations of the world are supposed to submit to an ecumenical Catholic authority in Rome versus a regional yet still episcopal polity, different from Protestant Episcopalianism. Dioceses overseen by that region. How does this not lead to a one world Catholic government? Great question. Well, for one, the whole world is not going to submit to Rome. Unfortunately, the Christendom is, because did because it's Catholic in its nature and by definition, or not by definition, but by its by definition, Christendom it is inherently Christian. Unfortunately, other like the Middle East and India and Japan and China are not going to be submitting to Rome anytime soon. That being said, how would things look if Christendom had taken over the whole world, or if there was somehow a reversal? Again, there is some very important principle in Catholicism, subsidiarity, and so basically, there would be the Pope, but there would also be bishops, diocesan bishops. They would have something like the United States Council of Catholic Bishops to make regional decisions, and so it wouldn't just be the Pope making decisions. He's obviously just the visible head of the entire Catholic Church, but bishops, and they still have a lot of authority vested in them as well. When the bishops are in line with what the Pope is saying, bishops are infallible. It's called the universal ordinary teaching of the Church. When bishops teach something that is in congruency with what the Pope is teaching, that is infallible. We should listen to the bishops. There's definitely we should definitely be obedient to them. If you can also look at the East, the way that Eastern Catholics like Melkites and Byzantine Catholics, the way they operate very autonomously. But if there's some dispute, they go to the Pope. So it'd be probably like that for the more East. The East that is less close to Rome, less connected to Rome. It's not part of the traditional Roman Empire. So the way that the world would look would be very different. It wouldn't be a government though. The Church isn't a government. It's a transcendental power. It's a superstructure that transcends any temporal government. It's superior to it. So it's not like the one that's making decisions for these leaders. It's the one that's going to arbitrate disputes. It can have the ultimate say if the kings are not doing their job. And now people say, oh, but what are all these bad popes? Well, a lot of the bad popes people point to are going to be like Alexander VI, the Medicis, the Borgias, these Italians. Anyway, these Italian popes that were basically installed during the Renaissance. So this is already after basically you started seeing the collapse of the West. We saw God's kind of judgment. The invention of the printing press being a very big mistake. The fact that basically ended the caste system. Now any caste can try to study for themselves, and that really boosted individualism and the Protestant Revolution, but a revolt. The Protestant Revolt, that's the way it's referred to as. But when it comes to like a lot of these bad popes, a lot of them were injected in this time in which the church, like things were already on the decline. Things were already kind of like the ball was already kind of rolling. The Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, and the were taking control, which is basically what the Medicis and the Borgias were. They were a merchant family that was very rich and powerful, and they basically had taken control. The church was under their thumb. The church was being occupied by these lower castes, or being controlled by these lower castes, and that's where we see problems. That's where we see these bad popes rise. But if you look at Innocent III, you look at like Gregory VIII, they're good popes. These are holy men. Many of them saints. Alright. Tucker says, I'm going to travel to an Orthodox country soon. What do I need to know about if it's okay to attend an Orthodox church, other Orthodox places of worship, etc.? It is illicit to attend an Orthodox service. So unless it's like a state of emergency, I don't recommend it. You can look for an Orthodox Catholic. Just look up like Orthodox Catholic places near you. I don't know what country it is, so it's kind of elusive. So it's difficult for me to like say, oh yeah, there's this one. The Melkite Catholics are really popular there. If you're going to Israel or other places in like the traditional Antiochian area, then you can go to a Melkite. There probably is some Melkite Catholics. There probably is some Roman Catholics too. They're pretty popular all around the world. But if you can't go to Mass, then you can stay home, watch it online, pray a rosary. You have no other way to go. If you feel that your soul is in danger, then you can go to an Orthodox service. But then that's on your conscience. All right. Yes, one of the goals is for everyone to become Catholic. But though that might be the mission and the goal, that is, we're a little bit away from that. This is going to be a while. The West apostatized. Okay, the West is like a post-Christian world. We're apostatized. All right, we need to reconvert the West. That's not to say we don't care about converting other people. I'm just saying that there's a lot of work to be done. So it's difficult to be able to come up say what's true about these hypothetical situations that are very outside of what we ordinarily see. And by the way, if the rest of the world had converted to Catholicism, I don't think it would have been Roman Catholicism. I think it would be like the East, the way that the Eastern Orthodox have a very different liturgy than the West, and they do metaphysics, or they don't do metaphysics rather, but they do They have their own symbolism, they have their own rites. So I imagine, but they're still, in harmony with the Catholic Church, the Eastern Catholic Orthodox, that is. And so I imagine something like that would happen. They'd have their own rites, and they would just be, they would just assimilate their own practices, their own, into Christianity. The same way that basically the Church assimilated their own Roman pagan practices into Christianity. They, for example, like the Pantheon was a place where they worshipped pagan idols, and then they turned it into a beautiful church, a beautiful cathedral. So things like that. And for example, what is the pontiff? Where does that come from? It comes from Pontifex Rexus, I think. No, Pontifex Maximus. I think. Yeah, I was right. Yeah, Pontifex Maximus. That's where pontiff comes from. The word pontiff, and that was in ancient Rome. It was the principal college of their priests, their pagan priests. It was like in the citadel, their college of priests, whatever. The head of it was called the Pontifex Maximus. The Pope is also called the Pontifex Maximus, not because the Pope is pagan, because they assimilated this pagan title to the Pope so that this people group, the Indo-European people group, would be able to recognize that this person is the head of the religion. That's why. And there's nothing wrong with that. Alright, what does the Catholic Church teach about depression, and how did the Church deal with that? What does it teach about depression? Despair is a sin. There's 3 cardinal virtues. Or actually, I think there's 4 cardinal virtues according to Plato. There's 3 principal virtues in Catholicism: faith, hope, and charity. This despair is a sin against hope. We have hope in Jesus Christ. We have hope in our salvation. Though we might not have sure confidence, we can have hope in it. How did the Church deal with despair? Not sure what that means, except for they give us rites and prayers to say that help us. Also, you mentioned one time some Eastern sects rejoined the Catholic Church. Can you go into detail about that part? Yeah, at the Council of Florence, the Greek schismatics rejoined the Catholic Church. It actually mentions it in this book. For about, I think, a few years, and then they split again, and then the same year they split, God rained his judgment upon them. Basically what happened is the Catholic Church during the Crusades was defending the Byzantine Empire. Byzantium was under threat by the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, and so in order to defend them, that's when the Crusades were called by Pope Urban, I think, II. And so it's kind of amazing if you think about the fact that the Pope was able to call men from England and France to go fight a war for the Church. It's never going to happen again. Probably not. Anyway, and so because of those efforts to defend Byzantium and the Eastern Church, they rejoined the Catholic Church at the Council of Florence. Unfortunately, there was a little incident in which during the reign of Innocent III, where Constantinople was sacked by some crusaders. Very complicated situation. All you need to know is that the Pope later excommunicated every single person who did that. So the Pope was like, once he understood the situation, he was very much against it. But unfortunately, the East got very upset, and so it kind of reignited the rupture. They left the Church because of that. God, according to, I think most Catholics believe this, they rained kind of his judgment down upon the East by allowing the Ottomans to take over Constantinople, which is now Istanbul today. The Hagia Sophia is now a mosque. So basically, they allowed the infidel to take over, that the East turned its back on Catholicism. If that's what you're talking about. There is the short history. Yeah, so I've been going on for a while. Any more questions related to this topic? Otherwise, I got to get some food. I'm hungry. So yeah, hopefully that answered your question, Latino Groiper. I appreciate the super chat. Very generous of you, big guy. Very kind of you. Big shout out to Latino Groiper and Winston tonight. And thank you, Nasuno, as well.
Maybe we'll do a call-in show. Is anyone interested in that? It's the Pontifex Maximus. 99% of popes were Italian. Bruh moment. Yeah, well, all I know is that the popes during the Renaissance were like these Italians and they weren't good, so that's all I know. That's all I gotta say. I don't know about the rest of them, but those ones in particular, not so hot. Is Pius X Italian? Please tell me. Boniface VIII Italian? The one we talked about tonight? Let me see. I need an early life. Early life. Ah, he is Italian. They're all Italian. It's kind of based at the fact that his family was all like the niece of Alexander the Fourth, the nephew who was the nephew of Gregory the Ninth. I think he was also somehow related to Innocent the Third. I think I remember reading that in the book. So the caste system, it really did exist, even if the popes weren't having kids, at least legitimately. There were still kind of families that were able to produce offspring of high caliber who had the aptitudes to receive metaphysical knowledge, which is basically what the caste system is, by the way. It's basically just acknowledging that we are different. Each and every one of us has our own individual aptitudes towards certain things, and even though we're all have individual aptitudes, we can kind of be grouped into certain classes. Just as you kind of have you have the genus and then a species. Well, you can kind of divide it further by saying that different people have kind of like some aptitude or spirit that inclines them towards, if you like to learn and like to read and like to study and or something like that, you might have the spirit of a Brahmin. You are really into leadership and to trying to maintain order and virtue, then you're like spirit of a Kshatriya. You like economics and finance, you probably have the spirit of a Vaishya, etc., etc. If you work in a strawberry fields and you're content with that, you're a Shudra. So, if you're Ouija and you're perfectly fine with that, that's a contentful life. There you go. And it's kind of like natural law on an individual level. We have our spirit, we have our aptitude of who we are, and that's basically the function and purpose of our life is to fill that. And when we do so, we kind of have what Aristotle calls eudaimonia. It's like when what is a flourishing apple tree? It is a tree that bears apples. That's what it's supposed to do. That is the function and purpose behind its natural system. And so what is the purpose and function behind some individual having an aptitude towards metaphysics? Well, that would be to become like a priest, become a monk, or to become a teacher, philosopher, something like that. And when they do that, then they're like that apple tree which grows. They're flourishing. It's called eudaimonia. It's like a sense of happiness that's more than just like motion. It's like a sense of flourishing and fulfillment. And they have fulfillment in their life. They're being sustained. That is why like modern capitalism and the alienation of labor is so destructive, is because people are no longer seen as like having this particular role that they're fulfilling. They're part of their occupation is this process of self-realization and identity, and like finding their theology, finding basically the natural law on the micro level. Instead, they're being alienated from their labor, and that's what we have with wages. There's something weird going on with the lighting. That's all I gotta say. That's basically the argument. It's basically about their spiritual aptitudes. Do Italians fall in the Aryan tree? No, I don't think so. I think they're not. I don't think they're part of that same. I think like loosely, but they're more, I think, Semitic. I think they come from more of a Semitic origin. I don't know. I'm not like a historian, but I think the Indo-Aryans are Northern Europeans, I think, and like, so I don't think that would include Italian. I just don't think so. My gut feeling says no, but I'm not a geneticist. I think they're still white. I think they're still Caucasians, but Aryan, like Indo-Aryan, I don't know. Maybe loosely probably, but not directly. Not the same way I am. waste. All right. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'll wrap this up. Let me check the entropy link one more time. Last time, I'm gonna check it tonight. Okay, I think that's good for tonight. Thank you guys for listening in here. I appreciate you guys' participation. I hope you guys learned something new, walked away with some new bit of knowledge, or something, something to hang your hat on, because I won't be streaming for a while, so hopefully it was a good last stream. In any case, guys, I really appreciate the fact that so many people stuck around for this. I was worried I'd lose a lot of people's attentions just because it's very abstract. So that's awesome to see. Everyone has a great rest of your night, and remember to stay awesome.